Welcome, everyone. I am Professor Carolyn Dudek. I am the chair of the Political Science Department. Ooh, now we got it too loud. And I'm also the director of European Studies. The event today is sponsored by Hofstra's European Studies program. And for those of you that are not aware, we have a minor in European Studies. Maybe many of the classes that you've already taken have European content, and that means you've already taken courses that would get you the minor. So if you're interested in minoring in European Studies, please let me know. We need to turn it down a little bit, or am I too close? Okay, we're good? All right. So European Studies is sponsoring this, and most importantly, the European Union, through the Erasmus plus Jean Monnet grant, which Hofstra received 2.5 years ago, is helping to bring our guest speaker in today. And we've had other events throughout the year that have been sponsored by the European Union. The theme of our Erasmus plus grant here at Hofstra deals with issues of anti-discrimination and hate crime policy of the European Union. And our themes have been focusing on issues such as anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, and also LGBTQ plus issues. I'd like to thank the Cultural Center for helping to pull this all together, and particularly Kathleen Collins, Carol Mallison, and Janine Rinaldi, who make this all possible, so I want to thank them. I'd like to thank the Hofstra College of Arts and Sciences Dean, Eva Badowska, who's always very supportive of these kinds of events. And I also have to thank the Office for Research and Sponsored Programs, because without them, we couldn't get this grant. So thanks to that office, and particularly Alice Boehm-Diaz, who assisted in moving this grant forward. And so I thank them. I also want to thank my colleagues, Professor Jensen, where are you? I saw her, there she is. She's somewhere in there. There she is. And Professor Pugliese from the History Department, Geography and Global Studies represented. Thank you for bringing your classes. It's so appreciated. So I have to read a quick disclaimer to be in compliance with our grant that this event is funded by the European Union. Views and opinions expressed are, however, those of the presenters only and do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or Hofstra University. Neither the European Union nor Hofstra can be held responsible for them. So I would like to invite our guest. I'm so pleased to welcome Professor Markus Thiel. He is professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University in Miami. He thinks it's kind of cold today, and he is the director of FIU's Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Dr. Thiel's research interests are the political sociology of the European Union and European Union politics more generally, as well as human rights and identity politics. He graduated with a PhD from the University of Miami in 2005 and has published several EU-related articles and book chapters in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of European Integration, the Journal of Common Market Studies, and others. In addition, his research on the political sociology of the European Union produced the monographs The Limits of Transnationalism, EU Civil Society and Human Rights Advocacy, as well as 5 co-edited volumes on diversity in the European Union, identity politics in the age of globalization, European identity and culture, narratives of transnational belonging, sexualities in world politics, how LGBTQ claims shape international relations, and EU development policies between norms and geopolitics. Most recently, he published the EU's International LGBTI Rights Promotion, Promises and Pitfalls, and co-authored The Politics of Social Exclusion in Europe. And I could go on because he has won a ton of grants and is probably the person who writes and publishes on the area of EU LGBTI, as they say in Europe, issues. So I am so thankful he was able to come, and it's really a delight to have you. So without further ado, I would like to give you the podium. Thank you.
Thank you so Thank you so much, Professor Dudek. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me, right, as well as the EU's Jean Monnet program, without which, we couldn't do many, as we're both, fellows of the Jean Monnet program. Without the EU's help, we couldn't finance many of these activities that you experience here. And as well, I want to thank Hofstra University, right, and all the various centers and the professors that are here. Thank you for being here. And you, that you have enough interest in the topic. I would hope so, okay? So I'm trying to keep this somewhat short, in the next 35, 40 minutes. I have a PowerPoint that will explain you something about my last book, and would hope that, and then afterwards we can have, questions. You can ask questions, right? We can have a discussion, and so on and so on, okay? So let's get this party started. Hello. Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, you can see here at the cover of my book, which hopefully I think you have it as an ebook in the library, right? In case you're interested. Exactly. Oh, nice. Fantastic. Good, good, good. So I would like to hear if you found it interesting or not later on. But anyway, so the picture that you see here, right, that is maybe if you've been to Brussels, you may have been going to what we call the European Quarter, where all the European Union's institutions are located, right? And this is the so-called Berlaymont building. This is the building where the European Commission, the European Union's executive, is located. And here you can obviously see this massive, right, rainbow flag in front of the European flag, which I thought was kind of emblematic of the way in which the European Union likes to, illustrate its commitment to LGBTIQ plus, right, as they're called. I just call them basically LGBTQ plus usually, right? We can talk about these acronyms. As you know, there are many different ways depending on who you want to include or exclude later on. But anyway, my focus in this book, as you'll see in a second, will be mostly on how the European Union internally formulates LGBTQ plus policies, and then how it tries to diffuse those policies internationally, okay? So I'm going to say a little bit in the beginning first more about how the European Union does it internally among the 27 member states. So I have to give you a little bit information about the EU's institutional architecture. I'm trying to keep this lively and not too boring. And then I'm going to talk about some of the external policies. But first, let's take a quick look at, here's one of the maps for the human geography class, right? Hopefully you get excited. Let's take a look at this map here. This is the ILGA world map of sexual orientation laws in the world. Okay, ILGA stands for the International Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, which is the world's largest LGBTQ plus advocacy organizations. They have chapters all over the world: ILGA Latin America, ILGA Africa, ILGA Europe, which is the most powerful, most important one in that sense. And they produce this map here. What does it show you? Okay, it basically shows you the state of sexual orientation laws in a number of different areas across the world. So they have 7 to 8 different criteria, ranging from, family recognition, same-sex relation recognition, right? Asylum procedures, and so on and so on. Hate crime laws, right? Anti-discrimination laws, and so on and so on. Based on cumulative scores, they basically develop this map here, whereby, as you can see, the more bluish one on the bottom you have, so the darker blue ones are the one that supposedly have the highest degree of anti-discrimination laws, whereas, of course, the dark reddish, almost brown ones have the least degree of protection for LGBTQ plus people, right? And in fact, criminalize same-sex relations or homosexuality, right? So take a look at it, okay? What's apparent to you, or what's something that kind of stands out to you, one way or another? Don't be shy. Come on. I know it's Monday morning. Oh, sorry. Yes, hi. Yes.
Generally speaking, the Western world is more in favor of, especially including Western Europe, is more protecting of homosexuality rights in general.
Right, right. The Western world, as you said, right, aka Western Europe in particular, is more protective, right, of those rights. That's a definitely right an assertion that you could probably make. What else? Yes, please, guys. Go ahead.
In the Eastern Asia, like in Japan, South Korea, they're very private societies. So therefore, homosexuality isn't really something that you can market yourself with, I guess.
You can market yourself.
Well, it's kind of just like it's less of a thing that you can say about yourself, and
Right.
something that has more limited
thank you.
protections.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because exactly. Then you see also, I think you refer to the eastern parts, right? Where sort of exactly. I mean, if you want to have very broad, sociocultural assessments, you could say these tend to be more collectivist societies, right? Where the collective, the family, the community, right, takes precedence over individual liberties, and that then determines exactly a little bit of this gray area, because you can also see that the Eastern world, right, they don't seem to be also on the other extreme, right, of criminalizing and discriminating, right? It's sort of, if you look at the down on the list, they're somewhere in the middle. Although with Russia you could probably question this, and this map is from December 2020. Okay, anything else? There was another opinion or comment. One of you? Yes. Who had something else to say? I thought. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Here. Yeah. Go. Hi.
Hold on, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it.
Sure. Don't worry if you. Yeah.
The rule about the West being favorable to gay people is not a fast one. You can look, you can see, it's very small, but you can see Jamaica on the map. And Jamaica is not a fan of gay people.
Absolutely. Exactly. So right. So it's not necessary. We cannot have these strict geographic separations. If you know something about queer theory, we would call those right binaries. Sort of definite opposites, right? And we should ideally in international politics not have these binary. Or saying like all Western countries, right, are pro-LGBT, and then all non-Western are not. Absolutely. I think there were two more, and then let's. Oh, three more. Good. Let's take the three of you, and then let's move on. Yes.
I don't know if you're going to know this, but I noticed Nigeria, the top half is death penalty, but the bottom half is only 10 years to life in prison. Why is that?
Right. Exactly. Good question. Nigeria, right? If you look here, sort of basically at whatever, it's not the Horn of Africa, it's the other side of West Africa, right? It's basically a country split in two, and that's because the northern part is Muslim dominated, right? So they have Sharia law. I mean, I'm not an expert in Nigeria, but right, this is sort of the explanation that they usually do. Whereas the southern, more Christian majority part is, it doesn't have Sharia law, right? And that influences certainly the at least legal, political situation in the country. Do you guys want to quickly jump in? I don't think, yeah. If you speak up loud, please.
Yeah, just a clarifying question. What are the protections under broad protection that set it apart from just employment protection?
Oh, yeah, broad protection would execute anything that goes basically beyond employment. Employment, right, is sort of, the private sector laws, right? But then you have also, remember, you have a life outside of work, right? And those are all anything private law protections, as well as, public policy protections, right? That then come in addition to it. And that's actually kind of important because in the European Union, given that the European Union is a single market of 27, an open trading market of 27 countries, their anti-discrimination policies, the anti-discrimination directive only applies for employment law, right? But it doesn't apply in matters of either public policies or private law, which is a problem. Yeah.
It's interesting how you can still kind of see some of the colonial boundaries kind of playing out in a lot of this law. Like, for example, the British stretch kind of from Sudan down
Yes.
all has kind of the same level of red versus, you know, kind of the more French spheres are in orange, or some of them are jump into the death penalty one a little bit. But
Thank you.
yeah, those
Yes.
boundaries are still there.
No, perfect. That was a perfect segue because that's what I wanted to bring up. Thank you. Didn't pay him, okay? Yes. Oh, Karen, yes, please. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Would be in the red spheres, because look at, for example, Indonesia. They are in the middle with the lightest sandy color, right? And Indonesia is actually the country in the world with the largest Muslim population of like 230 million people.
Yes.
And so likewise, look at, you know, Egypt, for example, also being a majority Muslim country with a sandy color. So although no doubt that some of the Muslim countries are in very dark red colors. So just wanted to point that out.
No, that's a good point, exactly. And I actually chose Indonesia as one of my case examples, which I'll talk maybe a minute later. Can I just, unless it's really important, let's go, thank you. Okay, good. But the main point that you brought up here, exactly, don't take this map as face value either, okay? Because otherwise you may think easily, oh yeah, the West is doing everything right? And we have, you know, these backward, you know, homophobic places and locations and states in the non-West. Because as you rightly pointed out, I mean, guess who criminalized homosexuality across the globe in many, many countries in the 1860s? Exactly. It was in particular Britain, right? The British Empire that ranged from Canada to Australia, right? Across the world, criminalized homosexualities in the 1860s to 1870s. So there is a colonial heritage that is still with us. Jamaica was mentioned, right? That's particularly pronounced also in Jamaica. So don't take this at face value. Maps are one indication. I'm not going to get into trouble with our geography professor here, right? But you have to always, I always say, like, you have to consider the context. You have to contextualize what happens. Historical context, geographical context, right? Sociological, the societal context. Okay, so my intent with this book, basically, and my research project I'm going to present to you in the next half an hour or so, it was to kind of complicate that picture that, you know, the West and the Europeans are really always doing it right when it comes to LGBTIQ plus issues, okay? Even though they like to themselves profess that the European Union is the world's foremost, you know, multilateral organization promoting LGBT plus rights, okay? Let's take a quick look at Europe. Here, just a little bit of data, because, you know, as good sort of political scientists, we always have to present a little bit of data on the current state of LGBT rights in Europe. So look at the top line that says the share of Europeans, meaning usually the 27 citizens of the 27 member states that were sampled, that say in their country that discrimination is widespread based on being transgender, 57%. Also look at the line below. I hope you can read this. That says plus 9% since 2019. So this is a fall 2023 survey, a Eurobarometer survey, a European public opinion survey, right? So you can see here, the impression plus 9% since 2019 has increased, but that is the public opinion. Again, we cannot take always public opinion at face value either, right? Because it's the self-expression of how people feel and what they think about that they may share or may not share with you. 54% say it's a problem to be lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Only plus 1% since 2019 increased. And 47 say that being intersex is an issue, right? Intersex is has received more recently attention in Europe as a sort of, you know, where you're not, because trans is also very multifaceted, but intersex has sort of slightly more physiological component to, you know, gender variance. Okay, 72% of Europeans agree that same-sex marriages should be allowed throughout Europe. Now look at the map, however. This is the Europe, part of kind of like the Rainbow Europe map, as we call it. If you look at it, right? Similar things happen. Whereas in the previous map, Europe was more or less blue, now you see there are distinctions within Europe as well. Western Europe seems to be largely in favor of same-sex marriages, the green and the more dark green ones in particular, right? Where 94% of Swedish, Dutch, Danish, 88% of Spanish agree that same-sex marriage should be legal. And as you go to Central and Eastern Europe, what happens? Support wanes, right? From the yellow in Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, Greece, to the red countries where only 40% or less, in Bulgaria only 17% think, right, that same-sex marriage should be legal. And all of these are EU member states, where technically the European Union, again, professes to stand up, the European Union, Brussels professes to stand up for LGBT rights. Down on the bottom, 96% of citizens say LGBTQ folks should have the same rights as heterosexual people, right? And then 64% say that transgender people should have. It's also interesting to see that here the distinction, right? Obviously, we have allowed less rights for transgender individuals than for, you know, the LGB category, right? Okay, so just very quickly, I'm not going to go, this is the book table contents, but what I'm trying, just in case you really want to dig deeper, in my book, I first asked the question sort of, is there an artificial clash of civilizations? Are you familiar with Sam Huntington's concept of clash of civilizations, right? It was written sort of, you know, around the turn of the millennium, right? He said like, actually, was 9/11? Right before 9/11, where he said like, oh, you know, there will be eventual clash between the Islamic world, right, and the, you know, the West and non-West, and that has been used by the Bush administration later for the invasion of Iraq, yada yada yada, and sort of I also say like, and people have written, scholars in my field have written, Dennis Altman, about queer wars. There's a whole book about queer wars, right? The polarization over queer wars. And so I said, is there a clash of our civilizations over LGBT rights internationally, right? And my argument is, while the EU does many things well, through their highly visible, highly normative rights diffusion politics, it kind of stokes some of the unintended consequences that it actually wants to eradicate. Okay? Then I focus on norm diffusion. I'm going to show you a little bit what I do in each chapter in the following minutes. I explain how rights promotion is developed within the EU. And again, you can see from the previous Europe map that there is no uniformity amongst Europeans on that issue. And then I look at specific policy fields that the European Union has, such taking in new member states, relations to the neighborhood, such as everything from Ukraine to Egypt to Morocco. The Europeans' conditioning of development aid to the global south, right? And that they basically insert treaty clauses stipulating that Uganda, Indonesia, and so on, they have to implement the same level of LGBT rights as the European would like to see in order to receive aid. And how problematic this is, considering that most of the Europeans criminalized homosexuality in these countries to begin with 100 years ago. And finally, I also look at the EU's activities in the United Nations and how the European Union, as a very visible actor, is forceful promoter of LGBT rights internationally, but it causes increased international polarization over the issues in the process of doing so. Okay? And in the end, I asked to rethink and reimagine international LGBT rights promotion by the Europeans, because they are powerful promoters. And I say, don't just focus on LGBT plus rights, okay? Guys, we have to have a broader picture. It's not just about the regression of LGBT rights, it's about the regression of democratic individual rights that we see going hand in hand, right? So in order to strengthen human rights more generally, we need to focus on all human rights defenders, not just LGBTQ ones. Okay, little bit of intro into the European Union, guys. So the European Union, not sure what your level of knowledge is, so I try to keep it simple, okay? 27 member states. The headquarters are in Brussels, and you may know that the European Union, we say they share, the countries share sovereignty, part of their sovereignty, the national sovereignty, they give it to Brussels so that all 27 can coordinate common policies, okay? Again, first and foremost, that is in economic matters, but also in more and more related matters. Agricultural policy is run by the European Union, right? Environmental policy, by the way, is run by the European Union, okay? International trade agreements, again, run by the European Union. Human rights, of course, are what we would call a shared competence between the 27 member governments and the European Union. But the European Union obviously emphasizes human rights and LGBT rights in particular. I say here in parentheses, you can read here, membership. That means every new member that wants to be accepted, and the European Union, there's a whole list of accession candidates that want to get in. Ukraine, which you know, it has become a member state, right? It wants to get in rather earlier than later, but of course the Europeans keep it at bay right now because of the war. But in order to become a EU member state, you have to basically respect minority rights, including LGBTI rights. So Ukraine already had to change a couple of years ago their anti-discrimination procedures, right? For it to become a candidate state now. Then there's the so-called FRA that I wrote here. That's the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency. The data you just saw about European public opinion comes from the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency. The EP stands for the European Parliament. The European Parliament is a transnational parliament that all 450 Europeans elect every 5 years. By the way, they do it this June, so if you're poli-sci geek, check it out. It's very interesting what's happening there, particularly since they expect the far right in Europe now to win. And by the way, guess what? That far right will have a detrimental impact on LGBTI rights decision-making in the European Parliament in the next 5 years as well. And there is the so-called COM or Commission strategy. The European Commission, the executive that you saw with that rainbow flag on the building, developed the first ever LGBTI strategy 2020 to 2025 under the current female basically CEO or director of the European Union, the Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president, okay? So you can see here, altogether, you would say like, yeah, the Europeans are doing a lot for it. Plus externally, there's the 2013 foreign policy guidelines for all the European 27 foreign ministers who are advised to implement LGBT rights protections in dealing with non-EU countries. Okay? Good. But rights promotion is also advanced by powerful EU-financed NGOs, non-governmental organizations, such as ILGA, the one that created that map. ILGA Europe is a very powerful organization that basically has also an open door to the EU's executive. Now, it gets tricky. While that sounds good at first, image, EU rights promotion is also in external relations, in its foreign policies, it's contested, okay? Well, because it challenged the sovereignty when the Europeans say, we'll give you development aid if you implement Western-style LGBTI rights in Nigeria, in Indonesia, in Jamaica, okay? That should make sense. For one, because these countries, particularly post-colonial countries, say like, well, we just became independent a couple decades ago in order that we don't get told what to do, right? So it challenges their own sovereignty. But the problem is that international norms, such as LGBT rights, they are just norms, guys. Norms are internationally standards of expected behavior. There is no UN legal provision that says LGBTI rights have to be respected, okay? There are UN-based Yogyakarta principles, but they are not legally binding in the UN. So the EU promotes international norms, but norms are two things. For the European Union, as I said here, the European Union, for them, it's constitutive. That means being human rights friendly is important for the Europeans because it's constitutive to their political identity. Whereas norms can also be regulatory or prescriptive. And most of the global south country perceives what the Europeans perceive as constitutive for their own political identity. Most global south countries see them as regulatory, as, restricting their national sovereignty. So you can see here, right, a mismatch in the way the EU promotes LGBTI rights. So my own research, I consider myself a critical constructivist with queer theory thrown in, also based on feminism, of course. And in terms of the empirics for this book, in case you're interested, I conducted interviews with about 20 activists, international activists, as well as European Union bureaucrats, right? And I was an observer at the global LGBT summit, the Out Summit, for 2 years to kind of see how do activists engage with policymakers, right? And, you know, based out of this, I backed up some of my issues. So, main questions, guys. Is the EU's, as I told you, is the EU's international LGBTI rights promotion conducive to an improvement of LGBTI rights globally? Or are there unintended consequences, right, of that highly visible, highly normative, and pressuring promotion? Does cooperation with the UN and others make a difference? I'm not sure I'm going to go over this in the interest of time. And are there other alternatives to the conditional imposition of LGBT rights? And again, go back to what I said in the beginning. My alternative would be focus on human rights more broadly and focus on democratic regressions, okay? Rather than narrowly focusing on one single constituency. Okay. Yeah, that goes back to what I said earlier, guys. Chapter 2 problematizes the notion that the EU is a normative power. You may have heard in the Politics of EU class that the EU is considered a normative power, right? Ian Manners came up with it. That's one of the most highly cited, highly contested concepts. Because nowadays, in the age of decolonialization and where we have a better awareness of racial and social justice issues, I think we all can agree that the Europeans' normative power comes with a lot of historical colonial baggage, right? So that needs to be relativized. Particularly since that, again, creates what I call, and other scholars have also called, sexual exceptionalism. The idea that Europe, remember, is the dark blue space in the globe and nothing is as good as the EU. And by virtue of that thinking, of course, you create this us versus them dynamic, right? The rest, the lesser developed, less tolerant global south as is opposed to the exceptional Europeans. That creates geopolitical boundary problems, heteronormative problems, homonormative, right? There's a concept called homo-nationalism, whereby you basically, Sweden, I'm just picking here some country, I'm not sure about Norway, but Sweden, right, is one of those classic candidates for homo-nationalism that until recently, had a feminist foreign policy. Actually, right now they have the opposite. They switched governments. But, they were very homo-nationalist in the sense that we want to be sort of, we want every other country to follow the Swedish model, okay? That was advancing a homo-nationalist model for the rest of the world. And I have Brazilian friends and scholars, and they said, what the Swedes did in the UN was actually not particularly helpful, because the Swedes were always talking about goals and ambitions here, and the global south were saying like, oh, well, you may talk about, trans inclusion, but we have to deal with, food and development and rights for women and children. Okay, so there's a whole host of issues. I'm not going to get into it. What I'm trying to do in the second chapter, basically, as I told you, to problematize the Eurocentrism of the EU's LGBT rights, but also, guys, the Eurocentrism of human rights as they're formulated in the UN. Because if you had any international law, international organizations class, you probably know, right, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the UN, or you have Professor Dudek's class, right? But the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when was that created? Any idea? Yes, please. Yeah, just after the Second World, 1949, right? Guess who was the main sponsor? The US, right? Eleanor Roosevelt, remember? Most famously was one of the proponents. Yeah? After the Second World War, in a UN that only had 50 member states, not the world, it was mostly the Western world, plus in the context of a very polarized Cold War. So the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we all say is universal, right? Inherent dignity of every human being, yada, yada, yada. I trace that historically in that second chapter and say, like, it is also in a way, Eurocentric or Western-centric Cold War conception, construction. And we cannot forget that, right? I can answer any questions later on, but I'm leaving it at that. So rather than to universalize the EU's LGBTI stance, we need to provincialize and decenter Europe. Does that make sense? Hopefully. The third chapter talks about the development of human LGBT rights policies within the EU. And as you'll see in a second, when I show you the next slide, we see that not only are the EU institutions fragmented, but I'm leaving this out in the interest of complexity and time, but that the member states, as you saw initially already on the same-sex opinion, also are very fragmented in overall LGBT rights. And while I want to show you here the so-called rainbow map that ILGA Europe comes out with. This is the map as of 2020. I could have tried to give you the current one, but it hasn't changed all that much, right? I also went back till 2013 when the first similar iteration was held. Still looks the same. Okay, what can you see here? Well, similar to the world map, you see here the cumulative scores of LGBTI rights, legal protections. Okay, these are only confirmed the legal protections. Leave out any public attitudinal changes and anything like that. What I did here, I marked the borders of the European Union, guys, in black. So you can see here, right? What is the European Union? Turkey, I circled it because it's a candidate state. Turkey down here. Right? And the Balkans are also candidate, the Western Balkans are candidate states, right? Most of them at least. And so you can see here, well, Malta has, tiny Malta, together with Belgium, 89% out of 100, right? The top performer, right? In terms of LGBTI rights. And then we have the major countries. Spain seems very progressive, we would say. The Scandinavians, including Norway, right? Also right up there. But then you can see here the diversity and fragmentation within the member states. Okay? Now, just be careful, again, to take this at face value, because A, it only concerns legal provisions, right? Discourse. And also, we don't want to get into that binary, just as I said with the world, that the Europeans are doing great, the rest isn't. We shouldn't also say that the Western Europe, they're just performing better in terms of policy and are more tolerant, and the East isn't. Yes, there are issues with homophobia, cultural, state-sponsored homophobia, if you think about, Hungary or Poland, that exists there. But beware, basic queer theory always says, beware the binaries, because they're oversimplifications. So I want to clarify that from the beginning. But it gives us an indication. So why do I show you this then? I show you this to show you that, okay, even the European Union, which itself promotes a highly visible and highly normative and powerful image to the rest of the world, and asks the rest of the world to act according to its image, even the European Union cannot uphold the standards, the member states, the standards themselves. Right? So what happens? Literally, if you see this, and there are negotiations between the African Union leaders and the European Union leaders, which they have regularly, once a year usually, right? The African Union leaders will tell the Europeans, well, you know what, why are you admonishing us? And this is literally, I'm not making this up. Why are you admonishing us for our state of LGBT rights if you allow Poland and Hungary, right, to kind of create, Poland in that case, LGBT-free zones, okay? And by the way, you're basically killing our you're not acknowledging refugee rights, you're killing our citizens at your borders, right? But then you tell us that we should respect LGBTI rights more. Does this make sense, right? So you can see here where I'm getting at. A much more critical observation of what is a good intention, I would say, by many of the EU institutions and the member states. Okay. On top of this, chapter 4 talks about homophobia and Europhobia. And I contrast here two different policies. I'll try to keep this short because it may not be of interest to you so much. I contrast the politics of EU enlargement, taking in new member states. And you saw that there are some member states already in the waiting line, right? The Western Balkans. Ukraine also is now a member state. I should have updated that. Ukraine, Moldova, right, are official member states now too. But again, they are member states largely because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, okay? Otherwise, they would not yet be member states. So, candidates, sorry, did I say member state? Yeah, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you for correcting me. No, I don't want to say. They're candidate states, right? They would not be candidate, by the way, if it was for geopolitical pressures, but this is a different story. So I'm comparing EU enlargement with the neighborhood policy. And down here on that map, you see the candidates are the light blue ones, at least as of before 2022. And then Ukraine should be also blue at this point, right? The other ones, the orange ones, are the neighborhood policy states. Okay, so in order to become a member state, I told you at the beginning, the European aspirant candidate states in the Balkans, Turkey, Ukraine now too, they have to make sure that they implement not only anti-discrimination legislation, but they also have to allow for the holding of gay pride festivals, right? They're also kind of being asked to improve their same-sex relations recognitions. That can be, some civil union or a same-sex marriage, okay? So many of the candidate states in the past, and we had 2004, the Big Bang enlargement of 10 countries, they jumped through these EU hoops, the EU's expectations, these benchmarks, right? To basically hit those benchmarks. They became members in 2004 and 2007. And guess what happened in Romania, in Hungary, in Croatia, I think also in Slovakia, once they became member? They kind of invalidated existing LGBTIQ rights, okay? Because usually what happened in the accession as a candidate state, you have to prove to Brussels, to the European Union, that you're doing all the right things in terms of LGBTI rights, right? So you nominally, through parliamentary approval, you allow for all these pro-LGBT politics, then you become a member. As an EU member state, the pressure is off. And then you say, well, you know what? We should really listen to our citizens. So they put same-sex recognition up to a public referendum, okay? Croatia, after they became member in 2013, the Croatian government had a referendum, and of course they changed afterwards the constitution, right, to limit it to marriage being between a man and a woman. And that happened in 3 to 4 different countries, right? So you can see here, I call this, in fact, and you have it here, reversible Potemkin reforms. Are you familiar with Potemkin villages? Right? That fake, Russian villages, right? That were up. So they were facades. And so what I'm saying is like, okay, in the process, through the EU's pressure, there are these countries try to comply with the EU's expectations and norms just in order, as a facade, just in order to invalidate them afterwards. Okay? And that is a problem, because it means these rights will be suddenly taken away from people that expect them as an EU member state. On top of this, you add Islamophobia, homophobia, natalism. Natalism means sort of many of the Central Eastern European countries that you saw on that Rainbow Europe map, they are in demographic decline, right? That means their people migrate out of the country, and the few that remain, they don't have enough children to repopulate. Of course, they don't want to take in any migrants, right? Latvia had an emergency session of parliament over taking in 200 migrants. So what remains is natalism, the government's policy to increase births, right? And LGBTI families are not acknowledged as reproductive units, and therefore are also rejected. And a generalized nationalism, which is understandable, after coming out of communism, these countries wanted to be really sovereign, right? And suddenly they're involved in the EU's, governance apparatus, and are once again, just like under communism, being told you should do this, you should do that, right? I could go on and on with these issues, right? Again, I leave that aside. In neighborhood policy, the orange countries that you see here on the southern Mediterranean into the Levant region, right, all the way up to Belarus, but that's different issues. The membership incentive doesn't even exist. So we can see that over the years, LGBTI rights, despite treaty stipulations, despite being money thrown at NGOs as well as governments of these countries, LGBTI rights have not increased. In fact, if you want to have, so there's inconsistent and geopolitical policy application in both of these policies that doesn't have any effect. In fact, I want to show you this here because that's interesting. This map is interesting because it traces LGBT global acceptance. Okay, so that's different from legal criteria that you saw earlier, right? This is the global acceptance, people being asked, how accepting are you of LGBTQ folks? But what's interesting about this map, this traces it over time, from 2008 to, I think, 2018. The decade 2008 to 2018. Now, if you look at the neighborhood that I just pointed you out, the orange countries of the previous map, what do you see? Public opinion and acceptance has actually decreased. Those are the red arrows going down. Right? So despite all the EU's engagement of these countries, public opinion tolerance has decreased, which is another indication of the ineffectiveness of the EU's approach in those states. I'm not going to go over the democracy. You can do the same. You can see the same regressions with democracy. But this I just put up, in case you're interested, look at the bottom. Poland, Hungary, right? And many of the candidate states have actually seen a regression of democracy. Leading me again also to my overall argument at the end that you have to see regressions in LGBTI rights as broader regressions of backsliding amongst democracies. And so in order to improve LGBTI rights, you need to focus on human rights and social justice defenders more broadly, the ones that can maintain democracy rather than narrowly focusing on anti-Semitism, right? Islamophobia, LGBT, and so on and so on. That's also called intersectionality, but we can get into a discussion about intersectionality in the discussion section. Okay, development, how much time? Yeah, I'm going to try to wrap it up. Development policies, guys. The EU is, by the way, why do I have a whole chapter on development policy and development aid? Because the EU together represents the largest development provider in the world, right? Between 55 and 60% of global official development aid is provided by the 27 and the Commission in Brussels. So that sounds, again, great, right? But of course, we have to recognize that this is basically making up for past injustices. Also, all of the Dutch, the French, the British, Britain is not in the EU anymore, right? Even the Germans. If you look at where the Italians, where they put their development aid, it's of course their former colonies. So you have a uneasy or almost neo-colonial interventionism going on there, right? Plus, if you followed EU development policies over the last years, you noticed that there is what I call the migration development nexus, meaning development policy is increasingly used to keep migrants out of fortress Europe. So much so that in the EU, you can now deduct funds to host refugees within your territory. You can deduct that from your development aid. Okay? By the way, Britain is not doing any better since it got out of the European Union. In fact, Britain has slashed their development aid by 0.2% of their GDP. Okay? So much for, the Brexit. But that's a different story. Okay. Part of the problem is, again, this conditioning of development aid upon maintaining development aid at the same level that the Western Europeans have. And as you've seen with the Rainbow Europe map, even the Europeans don't have a uniform maintenance of LGBTI rights. That leads to conflicts about the curtailing of Global South sovereignty. It also, of course, is about conflicts regarding the rights norm, content. Basically, in some countries you do have conservative, religious, societal homophobia, but you also have governments, so-called state homophobia, where it's used on purpose. You have, by the way, American evangelicals meddling a lot in Africa, right, to stoke that culture war, and so on and so on. There's even the term homocolonialism, right, used. So, should be clear that EU's human and LGBTI rights agenda is seen as also hypocritical in face of the EU's protectionist trade policies. The EU has, over the last 20 years, by the way, phased out, in case you're into trade policy, they have phased out preferential market access for its former colonies and replaced it with so-called EPAs, economic partnership agreements, that are much more neoliberal, don't give those countries basically any chance in the neoliberal global system because they have to compete eye to eye with advanced economies. Of course, the security policies and refugee policies, right, which are very critical, which are, you know about the Mediterranean, 30,000 people just died in the Mediterranean last year, right? That's been going on for over 10 years. So, and to that you add the residual post-colonial concerns that these former colonies have, right, about any meddling of France in the Sahel region, right? And so on and so on. In this chapter, I look at 3 case studies. I picked actually Jamaica, as well as Uganda, because Uganda, you probably are familiar with, is one of the most notorious countries in Africa, right? Jamaica is the most notorious in the Caribbean. Indonesia is not a notorious, it's much more tolerant in many ways as a Muslim majority country, right? But I wanted to have kind of a global view of how the EU's policies, what effects they have in various regions in the world. And I didn't pick a Latin American country, by the way, because Latin American countries, if you remember that map earlier, are much more pro-LGBTI, right, at least officially. Why? Because many of them became democratized only in the 80s, right, and 90s. So they already included much more legal provisions later on, and are generally in the UN, they're considered more pro-LGBT. So I compare and contrast the EU's policy towards Uganda, Jamaica, and Indonesia. And all 3, I find that there's limited EU leverage, and that the results are largely ineffective in terms of protection of domestic LGBTI rights populations, in part because of geopolitical pressures. Okay, so let's look at Uganda very quickly. Uganda has, right, that Kill the Gay bill, which you may have heard about it, right? That's been brought up again and again, and just has been increased from only criminalizing homosexual acts to criminalizing being homosexual, which there is a difference in gravity. But the European Union, while citing the Ugandan government for political dialogues, is still providing a lot of funds, right, keeping on providing. Why? Because Uganda is also the largest migrant hosting countries in Africa. It hosts the most refugees and migrants within Africa. And so the European Union is very well aware that if we're really going too tough on Uganda, right, Uganda may not be as, may actually, let a lot of more folks, right, move towards the north than the Europeans wish. Jamaica. The European Union has pretty much lost leverage after Brexit occurred, because Jamaica is a former British colony. And so there's a little bit of a competition of influence between the European Union and the Britain through the British Commonwealth, okay? Where the Brits just historically have more influence, for better or for worse. Let's just say it, leave it at that. And in Indonesia, which was didn't necessarily criminalize homosexual relations, but they more recently actually kind of recriminalized LGBT rights. Why? Because it was a little bit of counter case, because Indonesia was a Dutch colony, and the Dutch were fairly liberal. So once Indonesia became independent, whereas Uganda, Jamaica kept the British Victorian criminal code, the Indonesians actually threw off the Dutch liberal policy as a rejection of Dutch liberalism to return to Indonesian conservatism, if that makes sense. Mixed with that, the increasing role of political Islam, right? And you have a problematic area. Plus, Indonesia, by the way, China, right, is the big player. And China is by no means pro-LGBTQ friendly, right? And therefore, the EU has very limited leverage. Okay, I'm basically saying the EU should rethink the conditional linking of LGBT rights to trade and aid agreements, and be more careful and individualize their policies, because a lot of what the EU does internationally is according to regions, and you cannot just have one fits all policies, particularly in such sensitive policy areas. Very quickly, guys, this is probably you all know this lady, right? Hillary Clinton, who proclaimed at the UN in 2011, remember? At the Human Rights Council, gay rights are human rights and human rights are gay rights. And that was sort of important coming from one of the most powerful countries in the planet, right? Now, that sounds good. It expresses, again, Western support, but there are scholars such as Cynthia Weber in her book Queer International Relations who say that, well, Hillary Clinton basically is an example of US sexual exceptionalism only under the Obama administration, right? If you compare that to other later ones. And that also led to the denigrating of a whole host of non-compliant Global South states. So my main point, in the interest of time, I'm going to cut it short. My main point is that the European Union is an exceptional, powerful actor, just like the US, in terms of LGBT rights promotion at the UN. At the UN's Human Rights Council in Geneva, over time, as you can see here, in that line that says progress, the Europeans have introduced not only LGBTI rights resolutions, which, by the way, are not politically legally binding, right? Unlike a UN Security Council resolutions, but they're symbolically important. So the Europeans have introduced LGBTI rights over the years, and in 2011, we actually, in the Human Rights Council for the first time, had the passing of the UN's LGBTI rights resolution, which was highly contested. In 2016 now, we have, since 2016, the UN independent experts on LGBTI rights, right? Also a highly contested special envoy position. But my main point, not going to go over the second part, is that on the bottom here, the EU's high visibility politics at the UN has had some successes at the expense of greater polarization of LGBTI rights internationally, right? So basically the argument is, yes, we have seen some of these successes, but they came with a whole host of negative, unintended consequences for LGBTI populations in less safe countries. And finally, this is pictures actually from Poland, from one of these anti-abortion rights demonstrations. I don't know if you know, but Poland under the last government, right, eliminated any abortion. Sounds familiar, doesn't it here, right? In the US, that's happening right now in various states. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I wish I could abort my government, the statement on the poster here. I also make that case, I also show this here because I make the case that the LGBT rights movement in Poland was very powerfully connected to the feminist movement in Poland. And they were also instrumental in bringing up the change in government that we now have in Poland. So we'll hope that Poland will actually take its rightful status as a more progressive rather than restrictive government, right? But the main point of this chapter is that basically, while there are some unintended consequences of the EU's actions, as I said before, we have to see the regression of LGBTI rights within larger democratic setbacks. Don't forget that. And consequently, that means we need to, of course, support LGBTI rights activists, okay? But we cannot do that in that we highlight their fate in Uganda, so much so that then Ugandan activist organizations tell the European governments in open letters, please don't cut development aid because you're making our lives here in Uganda impossible, right? So we need to find a better solution. We need to focus not only on LGBTI rights promoters, but we need to have an intersectional policy on all rights defenders, right? Including not only human rights defenders, but also democracy-sustaining defenders. There's women's rights movements, which are much more powerful in most countries. These are educational institutions. If you know a little bit about Hungary, what happened there. I'm from Florida. I think you're much more lucky in that regard, but the DeSantis administration, right, is precisely fighting academic freedom because we're seen as critical, literally we're called indoctrinators, which is far from the truth, right? We need to also the free independent media needs to be supported because much of it is co-opted by authoritarian governments. Courts, the independence of courts need to be preserved, and we know here what we're talking about, right? After some of the recent Supreme Court decisions here, including Roe versus Wade, right? And so on. The main point basically being that the EU needs to be more self-critical in its policies. External policies we need to be more individualized, and we need to support democracies abroad, including LGBTI rights, right? But we need to stay away from a highly visible focus on LGBTI rights defenders that then makes their work much more difficult. Thanks, that was a lot. So thanks for your attention, and I'm open to all of your questions and comments. Thanks, guys. Don't be shy, come on. Hot topic. Yes, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you very much for that presentation. By the way, that was very informative. I had a question regarding the decolonized countries, especially poorer countries. Do you think there is a degree of fairness in some country, like you mentioned Indonesia, for example, rejecting the traditional colonial policies that may include pro-LGBT rights? And how would you suggest that we combat that anti-LGBT policies? Because the reasoning, in my opinion, is fair to reject colonialism, which is a big problem in the modern world. How would you suggest we reconcile the two?
Yes. No, exactly. Yeah, so that's really a good, interesting question. I do think also that exactly the reasoning is understandable, right? And I think we need to kind of support, particularly as the Europeans, I'm just saying we the Europeans, we need to support the independent decisions that these governments make, right? Particularly given that colonization had such a detrimental impact on these countries. However, I don't think it is helpful for the way current EU aid is structured in Indonesia or elsewhere, right? By stipulating, that Indonesia has to do X, Y, and Z, basically using the same measures that are created within the very unique context of the European Union and apply that to a very dissimilar global south context, right? That is not helpful. So then the question becomes, what could we do better, right? In which way could we do, what could we do really to, I think much more, if you look at particularly the Indonesian case, which I look more in for that case study chapter, we need to provide NGOs there, local NGOs, with more easy way of gaining funding. Because funding in some of these countries is for high visibility events. For example, for the holding of gay pride marches. Most Indonesians, and actually I have it in my book, but I didn't show you this, they don't have the notion of coming out, right? They don't have pride marches. For them, pride marches is something very US, Western-centric. So why would European embassies or the European External Action Service fund pride marches if it's just a high visibility one-off event that actually doesn't produce any long-term results? So funding to NGOs needs to be provided that is also much more easily to attain. EU funding is very hard to get also for civil society organizations, and only the ones who speak basically perfect English, right? Who can write grant applications, who have the administrative capacity to use those, they profit from it. That leaves maybe 3 organizations, the biggest one in Jakarta, but the rest of the country doesn't get to see anything, right? So there are many ways, in which you can provide, much more sustainable support rather than the conditional pressure politics that's being done or the high visibility politics or the aid that's being provided. Does that make sense?
Yes,
I mean, I don't have the solution to all this. This is a very problematic, right?
Yes.
I'm not saying that I have the solution to that, but what I'm trying to say is the European Union needs to get a step up from its, self-idealizing horse, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hey.
So you talked a lot about gay rights globally, but you only very briefly touched on gay rights' less popular sibling, transgender rights.
Yes.
So what about that,
Yeah.
essentially?
No. What do you about? Can you just? I mean, yes, exactly. That is a problematic division, right? And
Because it's part of the acronym.
Yes.
But it's the part everybody talks less about.
Yes, absolutely.
So what can we do to help further that, in addition to furthering the rights of homosexual people
right.
in and of themselves?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. Thank you. That's actually, it's a really important question, right? Because we've seen the same here with the human rights campaign, if you're familiar, right? The US's largest LGBTQ advocacy group, and the European ILGA Europe, for example, they are doing fairly good work on trans rights, as well as now intersex rights, right? So they are recognizing that's important to put more emphasis not only on the ones who own sexuality and sexual orientation, right? But more the gender expression and gender identity folks. For example, what I think is problematic also, and I was gay married, but is that focus on gay marriage, okay? Because the focus on gay marriage is something very actually heteronormative. That means we try as homosexuals or gay, lesbians, and transgender folks, we try to emulate the traditional family models, right? And so I think much more important would be more outreach support for trans rights as well as intersex rights. But as you yourself probably know, I don't have to tell you this, even within part of the problem with policy support by the European Union or by governments is that governments need a fairly distinct and cohesive political identity and community, right? And the trans community is quite diverse, right? Gender fluid folks, trans men, trans women, right? You have it, right? Asexual. So for policymakers, it is a little bit problematic to adjust the right policies. So really support needs to come, of course, also through strong transgender and intersex advocacy group. And they need to get the support. They need to provide input for policymakers so that they can do the best action. That's all I can tell you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in your book, you cited a quote from a Polish Conservative Party member who said...
Good, you read the book. Somebody who reads articles and books.
Who said LGBT is not people but an ideology.
Right.
Do you think this is a sentiment that will continue to rise throughout Europe along with the rise of the far right? Yes.
And you know what? Within the field of LGBTI research, and I just came back last week, I was at our largest association, International Satire Association, 5,000 people, and we have, so I have an update on it's not a really current research right now doesn't focus so much on the pros and cons of LGBTI policy, but the fight against what they call gender ideology, okay? So, but notice, it's not LGBTI ideology. It's gender ideology. Why? Because gender ideology is much broader and you can basically capture both, right? Feminist movements, right? Or gender-based movements, as well as sex rights movements. Okay? Yes, please. Do you want to add to that? Yeah. Yes, but I would, if I may, I would almost make it I don't know if I understood you correct, but I almost say the opposite, right? In the sense that it conflates and merges both, like, right? Anti-gender, anti-feminist, you basically, and this is a movement that came out of the Vatican, right, in the 1980s, and now has been adopted by many policymakers, everyone from Putin to Orban to Meloni, Italy, yada, 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 right? So in that sense, yes, that fight will continue, but now it's phrased and framed more broadly as anti-gender ideology, so you see probably much more coming out in that respect. And that is an ongoing struggle that is very complex, and I actually presented at the conference a paper on dark diplomacy on the transnational linkages between the US far right and their involvement in stoking these anti-gender wars. There's hundreds of millions of euros and dollars are provided from the US to European through US NGOs and think tanks to basically stoke that culture war in Europe. On top of this, you have Russia's Putin's misinformation and financing of extreme left and rightist parties in Europe. And you have Europe as well as Africa as the perfect breeding grounds for these culture wars. So they're not going to go away.
Okay,
Short
thank
answer.
you.
Thank you. Hey.
Hello. My question relates to how it's possible to balance anti-Islamophobia measures with also trying to promote pro-LGBT measures, considering that it is only Muslim majority countries that have the death penalty.
Yes. Okay. Yes. No. That's an important question. But again, I would say it's not just right. Don't focus just on religion. It's not just Muslim majority countries. It's also countries, remember, that were colonized, right, and where criminalization was actually affected by the colonial powers, right. So we have to be careful with these statements. But yeah, Islam, of course, is certainly in that sense sexually much more conservative. But nevertheless, if you think back of the history, right. In many Islamic countries, they don't have, of course, they sometimes, if Iran, the Iranian government says, we don't have LGBT folks, in a certain way, this is provocative, okay, they may be right. Because LGBTI folks is the Western label for non-normative sexualities, okay? They may not have these Western sexualities, but they had gender fluidity, right? They have, premarital homosexuality. They have homophilia. They have all of these. So, Islam, that had to do with some indigeneity within cultures. That was present already before. Then the European colonizers came in. As Islamic, the religion itself, the imams and so on, they did their own thing. So if we're now thinking what can be done to improve on this, of course, you have to guarantee the sovereign rights of these countries. But, I'm just thinking of, we could, for example, provide more aid in the European Union for refugees from these countries. Okay? The same from Russia. We cannot intervene against Putin's homophobia within the country. It's just not possible for a number of reasons, okay? But the Europeans could certainly do more in providing refuge, asylum, right? More human rights compliant asylum for these countries in their territories. They could provide more funding to the extent that's possible and not politically contested in Russia, in Iran, in Turkey, right? In these countries, so that there could be hopefully a more bottom-up, organic attitudinal change happening. Because these countries, they also have somewhat free press. They have the internet. They see that the Europeans and other countries, that they have fairly liberal sexualities and the world is not ending. So if you look at public opinion, even in Islamic countries, even in conservative Catholic countries or whatever, over the last decades, in many countries, there has also been a positive trend towards more acceptance, not only the negative ones that I showed you, right?
Yeah, I was wondering as well about specifically refugees in Europe.
Yeah.
Whether.
Yeah.
I was wondering if do Muslim refugees in Europe, do you have any data about whether they become, less homophobic, to put it bluntly?
Yeah, I mean that's a little bit of, I'm not a scholar of Islam in Europe, right?
Yeah.
That's a little bit, there was this notion of developing a sort of European Islam, which would be a sort of a liberal Western style Islam, okay, and that has not bared, as far as I know, no fruits, okay. The Dutch and the Germans, they have opened some sort of inclusive mosques and all that stuff. I think the one in Berlin had to close more recently, right? So that is a difficult undertaking for a number of reasons. But this is where it becomes tricky. I do think then that the hosting governments, the refugee hosting governments in Western Europe, that they need to be very clear and need to say like, okay, you're getting, even for heterosexual Iranian, Moroccan, whatever, Egyptian refugees, right? Or asylum claimants. They need to be very clear and say like, you're here, you have to kind of respect, you have to be respectful, and you have to sort of provide a certain base of tolerance because you're in our country as a guest. But you can see here that that is also tendentially problematic, right? Because here we're getting also into it's between host rights, right, and being a host rights and being a good visitor for a while, and also sort of indoctrinating or imposing your own standards on these refugees from different cultural circles. That's a problematic, and I think we see developments, hopefully progressive developments, only in the next decade or so.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Hey.
Hello. Hi, Professor Dudek. When you mentioned the progressive laws earlier, that on the map of the entire globe, and then also the acceptance is, could you possibly elaborate further on LGBTI individuals who are also people of color in Europe and their experiences and how that differs from white European counterparts, especially with the rise of anti-immigration parties like the National Rally in France, Giorgia Meloni, and Viktor Orban?
Right. No, that's actually, thank you. That's a good question. As you can imagine, if you're thinking of it in an intersectional manner, right? And intersectionality is sort of the awareness or recognition of the intersecting facets of inhabiting different aspects that would make you more marginalized, right? So, you could be, if you're white, lesbian woman, I'm just picking here, on somebody else, right? Then you're less marginalized potentially than a non-native, right, immigrant lesbian, right? And then if you're handicapped, you're not able-bodied, right? Then you have another layer of implications. So, and I think the European Union, as the overarching governing body, has tried to move in the direction of trying to provide better policies, more funding in an intersectional manner. But again, the national governments, it's up to them to implement a lot of these laws, and this is where the crux comes in, right? And this here you really have a quilt of 27 different policy applications, where these folks usually are, unfortunately, right at the bottom of the hierarchy of privilege or rights. And that is something that is theoretically basically recognized, but in policy implementation, not so quite, I would say. Increasingly, grants are being made available for civil society groups, right? But the situation is still quite problematic. But again, you have to look at country to country to country to kind of determine that, right?
Thank you.
No problem. Thanks. Hey.
Hi. So my question pretty much was, what can we do about the fact that there are so many countries that are in the EU who are supposed to be, at the forefront of having rights and protections and human rights for everyone, but have either reversed those rights after they've gotten in or continue to have issues within their countries that go against what the EU stands for, like, for example, Russia, who's been implementing, since the mid-2010s, increasingly more and more and more anti-LGBT legislation, where it was first you couldn't have pride parades, those were banned, and now it's you can't talk about being gay at all. If you talk about being gay at all, you can be arrested and thrown in prison. What do we kind of do about that? That these countries are allowed in, but now they have all these violations when it comes to not just LGBT rights, but also, turning over abortion rights and protections for women and all Roma, these other things.
You name it.
Banning people from wearing religious wear in public in some of these countries. What do we do about that?
Right. No, good. There are a couple of different, possibilities, right? Thanks, that's a good question. So first off, there is the EU Fundamental Rights Charter, and that technically countries with more restrictive, that had these more restrictive LGBT rights, or criminalized abortion, right? Like Poland, Hungary. Poland again is now a different case, but they're still trying to get out of from the bottom, right? Work themselves out of it. They have actually proceedings, legal proceedings from the European Union. So the European Union in that way serves as a watchdog. So if fundamental rights in the countries are breached, the European Union will send basically, so I do, cease and desist letter, right, with anti-abortion laws or whatever it is. But these are very politically sensitive, long-lasting political negotiations, because the European Union cannot meddle in, and these countries say, this is our own sovereign way of government. You, the European Union, Brussels, you have nothing to say about the way we conduct our anti-abortion rights, right? So unless abortion is enshrined in the EU's fundamental rights charter, there's nothing the EU really can do except this kind of peer pressure amongst the member states. Now, with new member states, that was interesting. Yes, instead of this, oh, you get in and then you're free to regress again. The European Union is actually working on changing the way they include new member states, such as the Balkans, such as Ukraine. And so one of the suggestions that they're debating right now, but it's not policy yet, is that rather than saying, okay, they get in and then they're 100% members, they get this kind of stage-wise introduction where they become members only in certain policy areas, right, over, let's say, a decade. So that you can more easily, the EU has still leverage over a decade of becoming a full member and can see how they develop, right? And the hope is that over a decade or longer, depending on how much long it takes, that these countries become what we call socialized, right, into a more tolerant stance vis-a-vis, women's rights or LGBTI rights and so on, right? So this is another. Now, but you're right, there are even in those countries that you see here, Spain, right? Spain has a growing far-right sector. You may know the Fox far-right party, right? So far, many Western European countries here, that Sweden right now has a center-right government. They govern together with the far-right nationalist Swedish Democrats. They had a feminist foreign policy until the new government came up, and now the new government had invalidated the feminist foreign policy, right, with special protection for LGBT rights and women. So that being said, what can you do within the EU? Well, you have to fight not only sort of the increasing far-right sentiment, which is hard to do, arguably, but we also have yet not totally eliminated, for example, Russian influence. Putin, aside, which you probably heard about, misinformation tactic, that's one of the biggest things now with the upcoming European Parliament elections, that they're Russian bots, right, that basically try to influence European voters on TikTok, whatever, Instagram, wherever you are, I don't know, right, with misinformation, and thereby steer public opinion. And that has to be limited, because the Europeans have very strict, for campaign financing laws, unlike here, right? The same has to happen with, propaganda laws, right? No outside intervention, but this is much more difficult, as you can imagine, in the virtual space. Okay, so these are, it's difficult to do, but I would hope that some sort of mainstream centrist consensus in most of these countries will prevail, right? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. No, thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone.
I just want to thank all of you for coming. Excellent questions. And thank you, Professor Thiel, for providing a European and global perspective on a really important issue. So thank you very much. And for my class, those of you who are coming for lunch, just hold on and we can all walk together over to the club. Okay? Thank you.